It is the spring of 1945. The war in Europe is ending. Church bells are ringing across English villages. Children are running through the streets, and grown men are weeping openly in the rain. But somewhere beneath the soil of the English countryside, beneath the roots of ancient oak trees, beneath the stone floors of farmhouses, beneath the cellars of village pubs, men are moving in silence. They are not celebrating. They are destroying evidence. Boxes of documents are being burned. Weapons are being buried deeper into the earth. Radio sets, stolen explosives, and assassination lists are being dismantled and scattered across fields that will never give up their secrets. These men had been prepared to do something unthinkable, to kill their own neighbors, to poison water supplies, to blow up railway lines from the shadows of their own homeland. And now that the war was won, the government that created them wanted every trace of their existence erased. The war was over, but a new mystery was just beginning. What really happened to Britain's secret army and the extraordinary underground network they operated from after the guns finally fell silent? To understand what happened after 1945, you have to understand what Britain had built in the years before. In the summer of 1940, the situation was desperate in a way that is almost impossible to comprehend today. France had fallen. The British Expeditionary Force had been humiliated at Dunkirk. Hitler's invasion fleet was assembling across the Channel, and the British government, quietly, secretly, without telling the public, began preparing for the worst. Winston Churchill authorized the creation of a clandestine stay-behind army, not a conventional military force, something far darker, a network of small cells scattered across every county in Britain, composed of farmers, gamekeepers, poachers, vets, and local tradesmen, men who knew the land intimately, men who would be invisible to an occupying force, men who could survive underground for weeks at a time and emerge only to sabotage, assassinate, and terrorize. This network was called the Auxiliary Unit, and at its heart was one of the most audacious pieces of secret infrastructure ever constructed on British soil. Across the length and breadth of England, Scotland, and Wales, engineers from the Royal Engineers and the local men themselves dug a series of hidden underground operational bases, known as OBs, operational bases. There were approximately 534 of them confirmed by historians, though many researchers believe the true number was significantly higher, with dozens never officially recorded. These were not crude foxholes. They were purpose-built underground chambers, typically accessed through a concealed entrance hidden beneath a tree stump, a hedgerow, a barn floor, or yes, in some documented cases, through the cellars of rural public houses. Each OB was constructed to house a patrol of 6 to 8 men for up to 2 weeks without surfacing. They contained bunk beds, food stores, a chemical toilet, a small ventilation system, and a weapons cache that included explosives, time pencils, 38 revolvers, Thompson submachine guns, and in some cases, Fairbairn Sykes fighting knives. The men trained in unarmed combat, demolition, and night movement. They were given suicide pills. They were told explicitly that their life expectancy after a German invasion would be approximately 12 days. They were never meant to survive the war. They were meant to make the occupation so costly, so terrifying, so relentlessly brutal that the Germans would lose the will to hold Britain. And then, the invasion never came. When Germany surrendered on the 8th of May 1945, the auxiliary unit simply ceased to exist. There was no parade. There was no medal ceremony. The men were called in, quietly, individually, and told that what they had been doing for the past 4 or 5 years had never happened. They were sworn to continued secrecy under the Official Secrets Act, not for a year, not for a decade, but for decades that would stretch into the rest of their lives. Some of these men never told their wives. Some of them went to their graves having told no one. The immediate priority for whoever was managing the dissolution, and even this process was handled with deliberate opacity, was the destruction of the physical infrastructure. Orders went out to local commanders to neutralize the OBs. This meant several things simultaneously. The weapons caches had to be recovered and logged. The explosives, highly unstable by this point, some of it having been buried for 5 years in damp British earth, had to be carefully removed and destroyed. And the OBs themselves had to be either collapsed or sealed. In practice, this was far messier than it sounds. Britain in 1945 was exhausted. Resources were stretched. There was no single coordinating body tasked with systematically locating and demolishing every one of the hundreds of hidden bunkers. Many local commanders simply sent a few men out with the instruction to deal with it. Some OBs were properly demolished, their entrance shafts caved in, their timber framing rotted away into the earth. Others were sealed with rubble and left. And some, a number that is genuinely impossible to calculate, were simply forgotten. The land changed hands. Farmers died. Trees grew over the entrances. Fields were ploughed and replanted. And underground, in the dark and the damp, these extraordinary little chambers sat waiting. The weapons recovery effort in the immediate post-war months produced its own quiet crisis. Some patrol members had taken weapons home as souvenirs, understandable given that, from their perspective, these had been their personal tools for years. Others had buried extra caches independently of the official stores, a common practice given the training emphasis on self-sufficiency. In the chaos of demobilization, the exact accounting of what had been issued and what had been returned was imprecise. Imagine the scale of what had been distributed. Each patrol typically had access to explosives measured in pounds, not ounces. Plastic explosive, primer cord, pull switches, pressure switches, and enough ammunition to sustain weeks of guerrilla action. Across more than 500 patrols, the total volume of ordnance involved was staggering. Army disposal teams spent months, in some areas years, attempting to recover it. Some of it was never found. Even today, rural areas in counties like Kent, Sussex, Dorset and Lincolnshire, the counties considered most strategically vulnerable to invasion, occasionally produce discoveries that alarm modern explosives disposal teams. Corroded tins containing deteriorated plastic explosive, buried deep in hedgerows or under collapsed outbuildings, continue to surface during agricultural work or building development. As recently as the 2000s, there have been documented cases of auxiliary unit-related ordnance being found and requiring professional disposal. This was not looting in the traditional sense. These were men who had lived with this material for years, who felt a fierce and personal attachment to it, and who had no real understanding of what proper disposal protocol looked like. In most cases, the recoveries were handled without prosecution. The government had every incentive to keep these men quiet, and bringing criminal charges against former secret soldiers was not a step anyone was willing to take. The OBs that were formally sealed rather than demolished entered a kind of geological limbo. Constructed primarily from corrugated iron sheeting, the same Nissen hut design adapted for underground use. Set into excavated chambers and lined with timber, they were not built for permanence. The corrugated iron oxidized. The timber rotted. The weight of earth above, combined with frost cycles and groundwater infiltration, caused progressive structural collapse. Most of them, over the course of the following 2 or 3 decades, simply ceased to exist as recognizable structures. The earth swallowed them. But not all of them. The ones that survived tended to share certain characteristics. They had been built with higher quality materials. They were located in drier ground. They had been sealed in a way that limited water ingress. And they had been forgotten thoroughly enough that no one had disturbed the entrance, which in some cases meant the timber hatch had survived and the chamber beneath remained intact. The first wave of rediscovery came not in the 1940s or 1950s, but in the 1960s and 1970s, when agricultural modernization began transforming the British countryside at an unprecedented pace. Drainage schemes, hedge removal, deep ploughing, and new construction projects began encountering these sealed voids. In most cases, the discovery was alarming rather than exciting. A tractor wheel dropping into an unsuspected void, a digger breaking through a roof of rotted timber, a farmer probing a soft patch of ground and finding empty space beneath. In the absence of any public knowledge that these structures even existed, remember, the entire program was still classified. The initial response to most discoveries was confusion, sometimes fear. Rural rumor attached all sorts of explanations to the strange holes in the earth: old mine workings, medieval cellars, ice houses. Sometimes the weapon caches found alongside them were reported to police without anyone understanding their provenance. It would not be until the 1990s that the full picture began to emerge publicly. Here is what most people who know the basic story of the auxiliary units do not know. The secrecy around the program was so effective and maintained for so long that it created one of the most unusual archival situations in British military history. There was for decades no publicly accessible official record that these men had ever served. Think about what that meant in human terms. Veterans of the Second World War were celebrated, commemorated, and acknowledged from 1945 onwards. Associations were formed, reunions were held, medals were pinned in town halls. But the men of the auxiliary units, who had arguably been prepared to make the greatest sacrifice of all, to remain behind enemy lines in their own country with a life expectancy of less than 2 weeks, received nothing. No campaign medal, no official recognition, no public acknowledgement that their service had occurred. Many of them, bound by their oaths, never asked for any. But some of them spent decades carrying a quiet, corrosive bitterness. They had been prepared to die. And then they had been told, in effect, that they had never existed. The first major public breaking of this silence came in 1968, when a BBC documentary touched on the subject, tentatively, with significant detail still withheld. But the story that truly opened the floodgates was the publication in 1997 of a detailed historical study that, for the first time, attempted to map and document the full network using declassified files from the Public Record Office. Former members, by this point elderly men in their 70s and 80s, began speaking publicly for the first time. The interviews that researchers conducted in that period are extraordinary. Men describing with quiet precision the training techniques, the weapons, the contingency plans, the specific names of German officers they had been assigned to kill, the exact entrances to OBs that had not been accessed in 50 years. Some of those interviews led to active rediscovery efforts. The Coleshill House connection is something that most people who know the auxiliary unit story only partially understand. Coleshill House in Oxfordshire had served as the training and administrative headquarters of the auxiliary units during the war. A grand country estate used as the nerve centre of the entire clandestine operation. The house itself was tragically destroyed by fire in 1952, a loss of physical history that is difficult to overstate. But the estate grounds survived, and they became a kind of pilgrimage site for researchers and veterans in the decades that followed. What made the Coleshill story particularly haunting was a discovery made on the grounds decades after the war. A practice OB, dug during training exercises for recruits, had been sealed and forgotten. When it was relocated and excavated in the early 2000s by a team working with a charity called the Coleshill Household, formed specifically to research and preserve the auxiliary unit's legacy, They found it in a state of near-perfect time capsule preservation. The timber framing had survived. The bunk bed frames were intact. Rusted tins that had once held rations sat exactly where they had been left. It was as if the men had stepped out one afternoon in 1944 and simply never returned. That excavated OB is now preserved as a heritage site, and you can visit it today. Walking down into it is a profoundly disorienting experience. The ceiling is low, the space is surprisingly small, and the quality of silence underground is absolute. Imagine spending 2 weeks in that space, in darkness broken only by a paraffin lamp, listening for the sound of enemy boots above you. Imagine knowing that if the hatch were opened, there would be no rescue. The pub-cellar connection, which forms one of the more cinematically extraordinary aspects of this story, requires careful explanation, because it tends to attract exaggeration. The documented cases of OBS accessed through public house cellars are real but relatively rare within the broader network. What they represent, though, is a deliberate piece of psychological engineering by whoever designed the access points. A pub cellar in a rural English village is one of the most unexceptional spaces imaginable. Every pub has one. Every landlord goes down there regularly. Barrels are moved, bottles are shifted, deliveries are stored. No German occupation officer conducting a sweep of village buildings would think twice about a pub cellar. It would be one of the first places checked and then immediately dismissed as too obvious, too ordinary, too domestic, which made it perfect. The OB's access through pub cellars typically had their entrance concealed within a section of the cellar wall. A movable section of shelving, a panel behind stored barrels, a trapdoor beneath a section of flagstone. The pubs in question were selected because the landlord was either already a member of the local patrol or a trusted civilian sympathizer. The arrangement meant that patrol members could access the underground base through a building that had an entirely legitimate reason for people to enter and exit at irregular hours. One particularly well-documented case involves a pub in the county of Kent. The landlord was a member of his local patrol, and the entrance to the OB ran beneath the garden at the rear of the building. After the war, the landlord sealed the entrance himself, told no one, and continued serving behind the bar for another 20 years. When he died, the knowledge of the entrance died with him. The OB was rediscovered during building work on the property in the 1970s, its contents still partially intact. The current owners of some pubs known to have had this connection have, in recent decades, turned it into something of a local historical talking point. In at least one case, the sealed entrance passage has been partially restored and made visible to visitors, not accessible, but at least acknowledged. A rectangle of darker stone in a cellar floor, leading nowhere that anyone alive today has been. The fate of the intelligence infrastructure of the auxiliary units, separate from the OBs of the combat patrols, is a different and in some ways even more obscure story. Running alongside the sabotage patrols was a network of signals agents, many of them women, who operated from concealed radio positions and were tasked with transmitting intelligence behind enemy lines. These agents operated under a separate command structure and were housed in their own concealed locations, some of which have proved even harder to document than the patrol OBs. The women of the Special Duties Section, as it was known, have received even less historical attention than the male patrol members, partly because their records were kept entirely separate, partly because the culture of secrecy ran particularly deep among them, and partly because the historical research community was slow to pursue that thread of the story. Some of these women maintained their silence until death. Others, interviewed in old age, described with remarkable detail the procedures they had followed, the dead drops, the cutouts, the radio schedules, but expressed genuine uncertainty about whether they were still technically permitted to speak. The signals equipment used by the Special Duties Section was, like the OBs of the combat patrols, largely destroyed or recovered in the immediate post-war period. The sets were high value and were systematically recalled, but the concealed positions, the hides from which the transmissions would have been made under occupation, were frequently located in domestic buildings, attic spaces, priest holes in older properties, specially constructed cavities behind chimney breasts. Finding these, identifying them, and preserving them has proved almost impossible. There is a particular kind of strangeness to the survival stories that resist easy categorization. A farmer in Lincolnshire, going about the ordinary business of clearing an overgrown corner of a field in the early 1980s, breaks through the corroded roof of an OB and finds, 40 years after the war ended, a Thompson submachine gun still wrapped in greased cloth. A builder renovating a farmhouse in Sussex removes a section of flagstone floor in an outhouse and discovers a sealed trap door. A metal detectorist in Kent, working a field with permission, finds a cache of time pencils, tiny brass detonating devices, buried in a rusted tin about 18 inches below the surface, their volatile contents long degraded, but their form perfectly recognizable. Each of these discoveries tells the same story, which is the story of incompleteness. The dissolution of the auxiliary units was not the clean, controlled process that the official record implies. It was hasty, improvised, and deeply human in its imperfections. Men who had spent years developing a fierce loyalty to their patrol and their equipment didn't hand everything over without reservation. Places that had been carefully concealed were not always carefully uncovered, and the English earth, patient and undiscriminating, held on to what was put into it. Today, the preservation of what remains of this network is the work of a small but extraordinarily dedicated community of researchers, local historians, and volunteers. The Coles Hill Household Charity continues to document surviving OBS, of which a meaningful number, estimates vary, but perhaps 30 to 50, retain enough structural integrity to be recorded, and in some cases preserved. A handful of county museums hold collections of auxiliary unit artifacts. The distinctive fighting knives, the time pencils, the patrol orders, the maps with their hand-annotated targets. The Keep Military Museum in Dorset holds significant material. The Museum of the British Resistance Organisation, which was established in Suffolk at the former auxiliary unit's headquarters in that county, operates from a building that was itself directly connected to the programme. Walking through it, you can see the actual equipment these men carried, the actual documents they were given, the actual weapons they would have used. There is something viscerally affecting about standing in front of a case containing a suicide pill, a standard-issue rubber-coated cyanide tablet, and understanding that it was issued not to a spy in a glamorous foreign capital, but to a man who farmed the same fields his father had farmed, prepared to die in a ditch 2 miles from his own front door. The patrol records that survived the destruction of documentation, and there were some preserved in private hands and later donated to archives, reveal the extraordinary ordinariness of the men recruited. Their occupations list reads like a rural parish directory: farmer, farm worker, gamekeeper, shepherd, blacksmith, veterinarian, publican. These were not commandos or special forces operators in any conventional sense. They were men who knew how to move across country in darkness, how to read weather and terrain, how to be invisible in a landscape they had known since childhood. They were chosen precisely because they did not look like soldiers. There is one final dimension of this story that deserves to be told, and it is perhaps the most quietly devastating. The auxiliary units were a contingency plan. They were built around an assumption that Britain might fall, that the south coast might be overrun, that the German jackboot might walk through English market towns. That never came to pass. These men trained for years for a scenario that did not occur. They dug their bunkers, memorized their targets, practiced their kills, and waited. And then the war turned, and the invasion never came, and what they had prepared for became, gradually, hypothetical, an event that almost happened, a war within the war that was fought only in preparation and planning, and never in the dark, desperate reality for which every detail had been arranged. What does a man do with that? What does he do with years of psychological preparation for something that did not happen, for the readiness to kill and to die that was never called upon? Some of them, the evidence suggests, simply filed it away and got on with their lives. Some of them found the secrecy corroding and isolating. A few of them, in the interviews recorded late in their lives, described the strangest emotion of all, not relief that the invasion never came, but something closer to a complicated grief for the version of themselves that had been ready to act and never got the chance. Their bunkers are out there still, beneath the roots of trees that have grown for 80 years since the hatch was last opened, beneath the cellars of pubs that serve pints to tourists who have no idea what lies beneath their feet, beneath the fields of farms whose current owners have never heard the words auxiliary units and would not believe the story if you told it to them. The war ended. The secret army dissolved into the ordinary landscape they had sworn to defend. And below the surface of England, quiet, patient, slowly returning to the earth, the evidence of what they were prepared to do waits in the dark for whoever eventually finds it.